you anyway?
An if.
I remember having very mixed feelings when the trailers for If came out. On the one hand, it looked very whimsical and heartfelt. There was a lot of creativity on display, brought to life by what looked like some very good visual effects, and I was especially interested in the fact that John Krasinski was making it. I'm not the most familiar with his body of work. I've never watched The Office, leave me alone. But I really enjoyed A Quiet Place 1 and 2, and I was excited to see him try something so radically different for his next movie. The main thing that was making me kind of skeptical, though, was that despite being a comedy, the humor that was present in the marketing, I honestly found more grating than anything else. All this led to it being a movie that I really wanted to be good, but I was also careful not to get too optimistic. And it turns out that was a smart move on my part. Now, the premise of imaginary friends being living creatures isn't the most original concept in the world. And for the record, that's especially the case if the main friend happens to be named Blue.
Suspicious.
But it could still work as long as they do something, well, imaginative with it, and give us a good story and characters for that premise to play off of. But unfortunately, that's not what we get. Our main character is a 12-year-old girl named Bee, who isn't a particularly interesting protagonist. She basically operates under the archetype of kid who lost a parent, a mother to be precise, because isn't it always?
Bumby's mom, she's...
And has grown cynical and lost her sense of wonder. Sounds potentially a little cliche when you put it like that, but if you were to flesh it out enough, it could be heartbreaking to see her lose that sense of magic in her life, and inspiring to see her get it back over the course of the story. But the film doesn't really make much of an attempt to paint her as this particularly jaded character beyond the basics of just telling people again and again, you don't need to treat me like a kid anymore, look how emotionally closed off I am. And once the fantasy elements of the story come into play, there aren't really any particularly interesting reactions from her that would help to characterize her. Her early interactions where she learns that imaginary friends are real and how they operate, her reactions mostly just consist of a lot of blank stares mixed in with plot exposition. There is one part of her character that I think is a little bit engaging, and that's her relationship with her father, played by Krasinski himself. He's basically the only link to her sense of fun that she has at this point in her life, and their scenes together are fairly sweet, but not a lot is really done with him in the story. They try to give him a bit of a story, with him being in the hospital for heart surgery and Bee being afraid of losing him like she lost her mother. But it's barely relevant to the overall story. Krasinski shows up a couple of times throughout the movie, and he always seems fairly happy and upbeat and never seems visibly sick or unwell. It's difficult to get invested in his condition when there's no discernible indication to the audience that his health is at significant risk. Not only that, but the whole thing about Bee being worried about him because she's been through this before doesn't get much attention either, to the point where if they hadn't not so subtly stated it outright, I may not have even noticed that's what they were going for. Ryan Reynolds is also present as a reluctant helper for the imaginary friends named Cal, and he's not particularly well developed either. That's the thing about Reynolds. He's one of those actors like Will Smith or Dwayne Johnson, in the sense that he's been in a number of fantastic movies like Deadpool, Buried, and Free Guy, but also a lot of, in fact you could argue more, terrible movies, some of which even he's acknowledged were not great career moves.
You're welcome, Canada.
His career has basically survived on pure charisma, which is kind of impressive in its own right, but that sense of charm really only works if he's playing a character that's supported by it, which we really don't get here. For most of the movie, he's a character who's very jaded and cynical, basically just for the sake of being jaded and cynical. Without going into spoilers, we learn something about his backstory that provides some explanation for why he's like this and how he ultimately ends up finding a new sense of purpose in his life over the course of the story. And when that scene finally shows up, I'll admit it's a little emotionally resonant, even if it was a little predictable. But since this element of his character doesn't really come up all that much until the end, I have to ask what we're left with for the majority of the runtime. As for the imaginary friends themselves, they're an element of the film that seems creative when you first see them, but the further you get, you realize that there isn't a tremendous amount to say about them. I'll give credit that the designs are pretty good, like this 1920s style cartoon character, a giant teddy bear who has some really impressive fur textures, and Mr. Enter, apparently. But then the deeper you get into the film, you start to realize that there's nothing especially interesting about these characters beyond the novelty of going, oh, this one's a banana. Oh, this one's a glass of water. Oh, this one's a bubble. You might as well just look at the movie posters for 10 seconds and you'll basically get the full experience from them. It'll save you an hour and 45 minutes. One of the very few exceptions to this is Blue, played by Steve Carell, but even he's a bit of a one-note character. He's mostly just absent-mindedly happy all the time, and there isn't a lot to him beyond that aside from, like I said, being slightly irritating. The other thing that disappointed me about them was that the movie tries to create an emotional story surrounding these characters, but it just doesn't feel as fully developed as it should. The main plot involves Bee and Cal helping the friends to find a new purpose now that the kids that have imagined them have moved on. Initially, they try to find new kids for them, but after that doesn't work out, they instead opt to have them help their now grown-up kids throughout their lives, even if those adults can't see them anymore. But there isn't really much of a sense that any of this matters. The movie tries to create some semblance of stakes in that if the imaginary friends don't have a human in their lives to influence, they eventually disappear. But this never gets addressed in the movie at all, aside from characters mentioning it a couple of times.
Or we just disappear. Blue.
We never see it happen to any of the characters. There's no clear time frame to make it seem urgent. The imaginary friends themselves don't even seem that concerned about it, so why should I take it seriously?
I don't know.
The last point I want to mention is in regard to what I'll charitably refer to as a climax. Skip to the time on screen if you want to avoid spoilers.
You might want to look away for this.
So near the end of the film, Bee gets a call from the hospital her dad is staying at to say that his heart surgery has had complications and they're not sure whether he's going to make it. This then leads to a scene where Bee is sitting in the hospital bedroom next to her unconscious dad. And for the first time in the movie, after being emotionally closed off since her mum died, she breaks down in tears, begging for him to pull through. Now, in a vacuum, it's a fine scene. It's nothing amazing, but it feels like it comes from a very sincere place. The problem is it just comes and goes so quickly and doesn't flow well with the rest of the story at all. Like I said, throughout all the times we see Krasinski in this movie, he seems like he's in reasonably good health despite the film vaguely alluding otherwise. So while it's not completely out of nowhere, it's still a really abrupt transition to have him be all happy and playful in one scene and barely clinging on to life in the next. And then after Bee's little monologue, he just wakes up. Everything's immediately fine, and this entire plot point takes up about 2 minutes total. That scene in particular really encapsulates how I feel about If as a whole. Believe me, the fact that I didn't like the movie doesn't give me any pleasure because I really wanted to. It doesn't feel like a lazy movie, and I genuinely believe that Krasinski wanted it to be good, but as much as I can appreciate what the film is going for, I just can't get into it, considering how half-baked the story and characters are. Let's just hope that A Quiet Place Day 1 ends up being more of a step in the right direction. Never thought I'd end a review of a family film with a comment like that, but here we are. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and you want to see the next one even sooner, consider supporting me on Patreon. The link is in the description below. For just $1.50 a month, you'll get access to all my content before anyone else, and you'll also get a shout out at the end of every video.